Ladies and gentlemen, this is DVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. On this episode, we're traveling to the South Caucasus, a region known for its breathtaking landscapes, cultural diversity, and growing geopolitical instability. It turns out Armenia has been shopping in their cart loaded with Indian-made weapon systems. Yep, you heard that right. India is now Armenia's military supplier of choice. Now, if you had that on your 2024 bingo card, I'll personally give you a high five. After a decades-long allegiance to Moscow, it was time to find a new supplier. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report.
As Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine rages on, Moscow's traditional and historical partners shift toward other international options increasingly more often. One of the most poignant examples is Armenia, which during the past years developed a strong multifaceted partnership with India. In 2020, the two countries formalized a $2 billion defense partnership, under the terms of which New Delhi provided Yerevan with a steady supply of weapons, including Indian-made Akash-1S air defense systems. The blossoming relationship provides both sides with a number of advantages. For Armenia, it allows for a stepping away from the tumultuous and often one-sided partnership with Russia, which became increasingly more challenging due to Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Apart from international isolation, the conflict reportedly led to Russia becoming consistently behind schedule with delivering arms to Armenia. For India, on the other hand, it allows for the solidifying of its position as a reliable business partner for countries outside of its region.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. So, Armenia has inked a $2 billion defense deal with India, which includes some snazzy Akash-1S air defense systems. If you're thinking, what's the big deal? Oh, I'll tell you that for decades, Armenia relied almost exclusively on Russia for its military needs, but now it's swiping left on Moscow and swiping right on New Delhi. Why the sudden change? Well, it might have something to do with Russia's little distraction in Ukraine and its, shall we say, less than punctual arms delivery to Armenia. That and the lack of support Moscow showed Yerevan in the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. Apparently, waiting for a Russian weapon is like waiting for your Amazon package to arrive in the middle of a global pandemic. It's not coming, buddy. India is now planting its flag in the South Caucasus, a region squeezed between Turkey, Iran, and Russia. With Pakistan and Turkey becoming increasingly chummy with Azerbaijan, Armenia had to look elsewhere for support. Enter India. For Delhi, this partnership is a golden opportunity to counter Pakistani and Turkish influence in the region. Armenia is now the largest importer of Indian-made weapons, and that, my friends, is how you make a statement. India, of course, isn't doing this out of sheer generosity. This defense partnership gives India a foothold in a region that's critical for connecting Europe and Asia. Meanwhile, Russia, the once dominant arms supplier to Armenia, isn't thrilled about losing its BFF status. For years, Moscow was Armenia's go-to for everything from air defense systems to tanks. But lately, Russia's been a little too preoccupied with the war in Ukraine, and arms deliveries to Armenia have been delayed. Pashinyan was pretty blunt about it, saying, "Our allies have failed to deliver weapons despite signed contracts." Oof, that's gotta sting. And with this whole India situation, let's just say Moscow isn't sending Armenia a congrats on your new arms supplier card anytime soon. The Kremlin's hold on Armenia is slipping, and this could be just the start of a broader shift in the region. Armenia is seeking new partners, new alliances, and India is stepping up to the plate. The irony, of course, is that Russia could have kept this relationship strong if they just delivered support on time. So the lesson here, folks, is that punctuality matters, even in geopolitics. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Rafi Elliott, political risk analyst at the Armenian Mirror Spectator. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thanks for having me back on the show.
So we're talking about India and Armenia, two countries that you don't really usually associate together, and suddenly signing this massive arm deal. What's happening here?
So it's interesting interesting that you say that because while many in the general global public may not see a relationship between Armenia and India, Armenians and Indians actually do. We're talking about a relationship that's several hundred, if not 1,000 years old. Armenians were probably amongst the original pioneers in the Silk Route that established trade relationships between ports like Bombay and then Amsterdam and London and so on. And an Armenian community remains in India now 600 years later. Meanwhile, Armenia itself has been a destination for many Indian medical students as well as other entrepreneurs for decades now. And this relationship, which has always been warm, has, as you just pointed out, with the signing of a number of very far-reaching defense treaties, really warmed up exponentially in the last 3 years. Really, this starts in about 21 when the Indian foreign minister made his first visit ever to Armenia, which was followed very closely by the signing of several important military procurements by the Armenian military from India, which include anti-drone defense system, short-range anti-aircraft systems, towed artillery, self-propelled artillery, MLRSs, which are multiple launch rocket systems, and so on. And it seems that as India puts more military tools on order, Armenia seems to be ready to buy as much as possible.
Right. Do you think that the shift from purchasing arms from Russia to from India is more pragmatic because Russians can't provide the materials anymore? Or is there also a political aspect of it where perhaps we're seeing Armenia taking a step away from its tie with Russia?
So it's inevitably both, because those 2 points tend to be intertwined whether we like it or not, signaling the fact that Armenia is now buying weapon systems outside of Russia as its main procurement destination is a political act, even if it is primarily necessitated by realities on the ground, which is that Armenia has an existential need for self-defense because 2 of Armenia's neighbors, Azerbaijan and Turkey, are quite hostile towards Armenia. Meanwhile, Armenia's main defense partner and protector, Russia, is currently embogged in the invasion of Ukraine, which is not going very well for it, and has consumed most of the weapons on other countries, including Armenia. It should be pointed out that since Armenia lost the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, put in a defense procurement request worth over $1 billion from Russia, and it seems that the vast majority of that order has not been fulfilled, since most of the equipment requested was diverted to the stagnating war in Ukraine. So for Armenia, it's a necessity, but it is also symbolizing the fact that Armenia is divesting from Russia as a main defense supplier and diversifying its supplies. And India is just very well placed to take the lion's share of these new orders.
And do you think that this move by Armenia will further a sour relationship between Russia and India? We know that India has been trying to play both sides on this war, but recently they've been warming up to the West and Ukraine a little bit more, and now adding to this new arms deal with Armenia. Do you think that the Russians will start to take a look at India and says, okay, maybe you're leaning on one side more than the other?
So India at the moment is actually emerging as a very dangerous competitor to Russian arms sales around the world. India has been transitioning since the late 80s into today from being one of the world's largest and most secure procurer of Russian weapons. In fact, some 80-odd% of the Indian military's equipment, as well as a lot of the indigenously produced weaponry, are Russian or Soviet derived. So now India is shifting from buying a lion's share of Russian arms to competing directly for some of the same markets. In fact, one of the reasons, as I mentioned earlier, that India is so well placed to benefit from Armenia's need for new weapon systems is that because the indigenous weapons industry in India is largely based on Soviet principles and doctrines, it is already backwards compatible with a lot of the equipment and the doctrines that Armenia currently possesses, since Armenia is a at least politically, it's a Soviet successor state, and much of its military traditions and doctrine kind of survive from that era. So India both has equipment that is understandable for the Armenian military realities, and also provides upgrades to a lot of these weapon systems that can give Armenia the edge. So absolutely, on its own, it's for Russia, it sees India as taking away one of its main protectorates, Armenia. But unfortunately, I think Russia has done this to itself by refusing to defend Armenia, both in terms of flexing military might as it is required to under its own treaty obligations, and in terms of supplying weaponry to Armenia, forcing Armenia to look elsewhere. And India is just happy to pick up where Russia is dropping the ball.
Right, and you mentioned the compatibility issue isn't that big of a deal since India, Armenia, and Russia use pretty much a very similar system and doctrine. But do you think this is a phenomenon that we will be able to see across the other parts of the world, or this is a more kind of exclusive to Armenia situation where people are divesting from Russia, looking for other partners to work with?
I think it's going to become increasingly that. I mean, Armenia is not so much a unique case as it is an initial test case. In fact, across a lot of the world, weapons countries that had, primarily we're talking about former communist countries or other what we used to call third world countries, which simply could not afford Western arms, could not afford indigenous weapons production, and often did not want to deal with a lot of the political baggage that came with buying U.S., French, or U.K. weaponry, and they would therefore go to Russia. But now Russia is seeing itself, obviously it's bogged down in a war against a much smaller neighbor, which is defeating it with technologically superior Western weaponry, which makes it difficult for Russia to continue its own current defense export procurement fulfillments, but also makes it a less attractive market for a lot of these former clients. And we've already seen a number of these countries looking to France and especially China and now India, two countries whose indigenous defense industries stem from Soviet support 30, 40, 50, and 60 years ago. So Armenia is probably the first one, at least in India's specific case, because China has already spent the last 20 years reverse engineering a lot of Russian tech and then selling it for much cheaper across the world and therefore stealing market share. Don't forget, Russia's arms industry is very, very tightly dependent on the promise of export sales in order to justify technological development domestically. So for Russia, losing out on these external sales is definitely a problem. And the reputation of its weapon systems also really matter in the bottom line when it comes to the sales. But India specifically, unlike China, doesn't quite have a history of foreign sales of its indigenous military equipment. Armenia is really, we say that Armenia has overnight become the world's largest procurer of Indian arms. That is absolutely true, and there's no reason to claim that it's not going to be that forever. It is a test case for India, which is increasingly coming to terms with the fact that it is a regional player. It is more comfortable in this role, and it is now looking to export both its soft and its hard power in the region. Armenia happens to be very well suited to be the first client for these types of large-scale purchases. It's also important to note that India has spent the last 80 years in a variety of protracted conflicts, primarily with its neighbor Pakistan, primarily in very high altitude alpine conditions, and therefore a lot of the weapon systems that India has developed indigenously are conditioned with their weapons profiles designed for this type of alpine warfare, which is exactly what Armenia, which is also a mountainous country, is looking for. So India is really kind of targeting its weapons to very specific tailored customers like Armenia, but there's no reason to assume that Armenia will be the last, and there's no reason to assume that Armenia will not continue to grow the profile of its weapons acquisitions from India.
Right, that's very interesting. Like you mentioned, the Russian weapon export. We basically known Russian as the weapon exporter for this part of the, well, a large part of a century now. Do you think that reality will change perhaps after the war?
I mean, it is already changing now. A lot of countries, again, you asked the question at the beginning of this interview, whether it's by necessity or political alignment. The reality is one is pushing the other. There are many countries currently which are historically Russian allies, or at least allies of convenience, who have now seen immediate defense needs being compromised by contract, and therefore are looking elsewhere for these fulfillments at the moment, because they have a need for relatively modern, relatively affordable next generation's weapons packages, and that Russia is simply not fulfilling. It's also true just of the performance of these weapon systems. There is a very infamous case in which the Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan criticized the effectiveness of the Russian Iskander-M ballistic missile system as it was used during the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war, which later caused a bit of a constitutional crisis inside Armenia, and especially garnered a very negative reaction from the Russians themselves. However, when you look at the Iskander-M's performance in Ukraine, for instance, in which it often overshoots targets, it often fails to explode, etc., 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 there might have been a grain of truth to these comments. So Russia very jealously guards the reputations of its weapon systems, and now that they're being observed in their natural environment, which is to say inside a conflict zone, there are many observers, potential buyers, who probably are questioning at this moment whether or not it's worth purchasing.
All right, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks again for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you for having me.
And now we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. The Russian military seems to be needing further adjustments in order to keep up with the pace set by Vladimir Putin. The Russian leader has introduced yet another modification to the structure of the Russian war machine.
At the beginning of the week, Russian President Vladimir Putin formalized a decree to increase the size of the country's military by 180,000 soldiers, bringing the total number of active servicemen to 1.5 million. The move thus raises the overall number of military personnel to nearly 2.4 million and marks the third expansion since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Previous troop increases accounted for 137,000 new recruits in August 2022 and 170,000 in December 2022. The latest expansion comes amid Putin intensifying warnings that Ukraine's use of long-range Western weapons to target Russian territory could lead to a direct conflict with NATO. The dictator has repeatedly cautioned that Western military aid to Ukraine risks escalating tensions, even potentially leading to a nuclear confrontation. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is urging Western nations to approve the use of longer-range missiles, such as the British Storm Shadow and US-made ATACMS, to strike targets deep within Russia.
As Ukraine faces rising threats to its nuclear power plants from Russian airstrikes, Kyiv continues to plead with the West on a supply of longer-range weapons. According to Vladimir Zelensky, the use of long-range missiles would allow Ukraine to tackle Russian aggression more effectively.
The Biden administration is reportedly considering easing restrictions on Ukraine's use of Western-supplied long-range missiles, potentially allowing strikes on Russian airfields. While the US has been hesitant to permit Ukraine to target Russian territory with its missiles, it may allow the UK's Storm Shadow missiles, which use US technology, to be deployed more freely. Ukraine has been pressing for more advanced weapons, including US-made ATACMS missiles, as Russia's missile attacks continue to target infrastructure and cities. However, concerns over escalation have caused Western countries to limit the range of weapons provided to Ukraine. Energy experts fear that Russian strikes on critical substations could trigger nuclear reactor shutdowns and potentially lead to a nuclear incident. Ukrainian officials hope the risk to the energy grid will prompt Washington to reconsider its stance on missile use.
Local figures continue to voice their opposition to the Taliban's rule. Veteran Afghan warlord Abdurrashid Dostum has called for opposition groups to unite and form a government in exile to challenge the Taliban's rule in Afghanistan.
Speaking to a Turkish-based Afghan resistance group, Dostum emphasized the need for collective action against the Taliban's unrecognized and unlawful regime. Known for his role as a former deputy defense minister and his leadership over a private army, Dostum has established himself as a key figure in Afghanistan's turbulent political landscape for decades. Although accused of past human rights abuses, Dostum has remained a significant player domestically, particularly in northern Afghanistan, where he once held power. He had previously expressed his willingness to confront the Taliban militarily, urging the international community to recognize that the extremist group cannot be reasoned with. The Taliban's return to power in 2021 led to widespread repression, including the persecution of women and minority groups.
As Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine rages on, the international community attempts to mediate the conflict in order to eventually bring about its end. In a conversation with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Kazakh President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev claimed that Russia cannot be defeated militarily and urged for support for peace plans proposed by China and Brazil.
Tokayev warned that further escalation could have devastating consequences for humanity, particularly the nations involved in the conflict. However, Scholz rejected this approach, emphasizing that Germany supports Ukraine because Russia initiated an unprovoked invasion in February 2022. Scholz stressed that Russia's ongoing aggression is the root cause of the war and must be addressed, asserting that Moscow could end the conflict by ceasing its attacks. Ukraine has proposed a peace plan requiring the withdrawal of Russian troops, while other countries, like China and Brazil, have suggested compromises that would allow Russia to retain some captured Ukrainian territory. Kazakhstan, a close Russian ally, has sought to balance its ties with Moscow and the West throughout the conflict.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.